And we are live.
Okay, so I'm calling to order the Historic Districts Review Board hearing for October 11th, 2022. I'll be acting as chair this evening. Melissa, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Chair Rios.
She virtual.
Yeah, thank you. Member Aguilar Medrano. Here. Member Berkeley. Here. Member Beachside. Here. Member Bienvenu.
Here.
Member Guida.
Here.
Member Larson.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, we have an agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda either from staff or from the board? No?
None from staff.
Okay, board, may I have a motion?
Larson moves to approve the agenda as submitted.
Do you have a second?
In the seconds.
You, Melissa, roll call vote, please.
Member Aguilar Medrano.
Yes.
Member Berkeley.
Yes.
Member Beachside.
Yes.
Member Larson.
Yes.
And Member Bienvenu.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. Next, we have approval of minutes. We have the minutes from September 27th, 2022. Are there any changes to the minutes?
I just have a correction
Sure.
on page 16. It says I do not want to see, when it's supposed to say I do not want to say.
Any other corrections? Seeing none, can we have a motion from the board
So moved by Larson.
to approve the minutes as corrected?
Yes. Move to approve the minutes as corrected.
Thank you. Second, please.
Aguilar Medrano, second.
Thank you. Melissa, may we have a roll call vote?
Member Aguilar Medrano.
Yes.
Member Berkeley.
Yes.
Member Beachside.
Yes.
Member Bienvenu.
Abstain.
Member Larson.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. Next item is approval of findings of fact and conclusions of law. There are 3 from our last hearing. Do we have any corrections, any changes to those? If we have none, I'll accept the motion.
Beachside moves to approve the findings of fact and conclusions of law as submitted. Larson seconds.
Melissa, roll call, please.
Member Aguilar Medrano.
Yeah.
Member Berkeley.
Yes.
Member Beachside.
Yeah.
Member Bienvenu.
Abstain.
Member Larson.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. Next is matters from the public. I'll be holding this to 2 minutes each. Are there any members of the public, either in person or online, wishing to speak?
Is this in general?
This is general comment. You will need to be sworn in. Oh, well, after this. Okay, sorry about that.
My name is Ryan Marshall. I am the managing member of Manhattan Properties. We own the property at 345 West Manhattan Avenue, which is currently rented out to Cowboys for a retail store. I wanted to speak to you all today about the proposed mural that has been proposed for 340 Reed Street. The mural and the organization that is involved with developing that have been in very limited contact with us, and our property is located on the south and west sides of the 2 walls that they're planning for this mural. We basically haven't gotten any information. I've requested a depiction of the mural and to discuss some of my concerns with them regarding this, and haven't received any information yet. I was led to believe that you all would be voting on that application.
So it's not on the agenda for tonight. Heather, maybe you can speak to this with Carly.
Yes.
I can.
This case was postponed to next week, or I'm sorry, next meeting,
Okay.
which is in 2 weeks. There was a request for additional information from the applicant,
Okay.
which was not received. So what I would suggest you do is contact us, and we can maybe coordinate a meeting, or at least open the avenues of communication,
Okay.
if you wish.
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay,
Thank you for your time.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And my card with me, but do you have a card?
Will there be any other public comments tonight?
And I'll just state real quick, please speak into the mic as close as you can.
Sure. Members wishing to speak or here in person, please come to the podium.
My name is Larry Reinbach. I'm the owner of Unit 7 at 624 Galisteo Street in Santa Fe. It's in the Las Brisas de Santa Fe compound, composed of 30 condominiums grouped around a private courtyard. Unit 7 is one of 4 co-joint units built in 1991. My wife and I have owned that property since May of last year. Since we've owned it, it's become apparent that 4 casement windows in the property need replacement. Sooner the better. I submitted an application for approval on September 1st. I haven't heard anything back. I guess my question is, how long does this process take? These windows are Pella windows. They are the same size,
Okay, so
virtually the same design.
this is a procedural question about your case being processed, not about the details of the application. So let's see if staff has any response to this question.
If this case were to proceed to the Historic Design Review Board, it would have to be, this would be considered ex parte communication because the case is not before them yet. We can follow up with you regarding whether that is administrative or whether it has to go to the H board. I can certainly contact you tomorrow to follow up.
Very good.
And I can speak to this directly. I know that emails have not been coming through. So please check your spam filters. I know one of our staff members, or actually our contractor, has been trying to get a hold of this particular applicant.
Thank you, Farley. Thank you, Heather. Any other public comment? Either in person or online?
There is one person online that would like to speak, Stephanie Venanato. I'm allowing her to talk right now. Stephanie, you may proceed.
Thank you very much. I had 2 questions. One is, I understand that the Lucchese sign that case has still not been, the findings of facts and conclusions of law have not been adopted. If you could give me a status of that case, I would really appreciate it. And then the other thing I also noticed today is that Sarah Novison, who has a gallery on De Vargas Street just east of Upper Crust, that she has still a big advertising sign out there on Old Santa Fe Trail, which had been removed. She had 2 signs for a long time. They were removed. One is back. The oldest house actually has a small informational sign because they too had a big sign out there. Now it's a small informational sign up on one of the signposts. It's about the size of like a no parking sign. I really believe that Ms. Novison should be doing the same thing, an informational directional sign, not a full advertising off-site, which is actually contrary to code. And I'm not really sure why it takes so long to have any action on some of these things, because it's just not a level playing field. There's other businesses down that street that I'm sure would like to have as big a sign as she has out. And I know Sarah and I like her work, but again, I think it's about a level playing field. Thank you.
Stephanie. Does staff wish to respond to that?
Acting Chair, we now want to respond with respect to the findings of fact and conclusions of law at the Lucchese store. That address is 57 Old Santa Fe Trail, and the case number that was assigned to that was 2022 5470 HDRB. My records reflect that finding of fact and conclusions of law were approved by the board in a regular meeting on September 13th. So those have been approved. And I'm aware that Ms. Benato has filed an appeal petition on that. And I believe that was received, according to the records I have, by the Land Use Department on September 6th. So we do have Ms. Benato's verified appeal petition. I know that sometimes people are looking for the findings of fact and conclusions of law to be registered with the city clerk and signed with the city clerk. That is not required under the code. When the Historic District Review Board approves the finding of fact and conclusions of law, that is what kicks in the 15-day appeal deadline. My understanding is that her petition is under review by the land use director under that would be a 14-3.17. There's a provision there for the process that when a verified appeal petition is filed, it goes under review by the land use director and to determine its conformance with the requirements of appeal petitions.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, moving on.
And may I ask, does that answer Ms. Benato's questions?
No, actually it doesn't. No, it doesn't, because I've gotten emails from Mr. Klug that told me, even as of, I thought the 14th, that the conclusions hadn't been adopted. And so I'm just curious. I know that my appeal can go forward because I was going to get it back and then refile it. And it was decided that it could just stay filed, is my understanding of the appeal. So if the findings of facts and conclusions of law have been adopted, great, then I guess it'll go to appeal. But I just got an email. I was out of town for over 2 weeks and got an email from Mr. Klug, and I thought it indicated that it still hadn't been adopted and that I could have an opportunity to make comments. And I don't understand when that would happen. So that was my question.
Well, I'm just reciting what my records show with respect to the board meeting on September 13th. It does indicate that those were approved by the board, which is what the final action is under 14-3.17.
Thank you. If there are no further comments from the public, I'll move on to staff communications. Carly.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I do have a few items here for this evening. Let's see, we have our senior planner interviews upcoming. So we have 3 positions, 3 senior planner positions. As we know, Angela is Angela is one of those. Now we have Ramon on staff, who we introduced at one of the previous hearings, who will also be helping out with current planning, but we'll be interviewing for the other senior planner position this week and next week. So we're really excited about that, getting them up and running and getting further with our division. We are working on the 2023 calendar that should be coming out very, very soon to the board. So that just keep your eyes peeled on the next few hearings. We'll be introducing that. We are, we'll fluctuate on the amount of administrative matters hearings that we have. So we'll just be interested to know before we send that out what the board's thoughts are, if we can get some thoughts maybe tonight on how these go, and having, I think we've got 3 for this year that we've had. This is our 3rd, and how the board really sees that. That said, the other item that we have is, as soon as we have a full board in attendance, and we don't tonight, we need to do our election tonight. We need to do our elections for our chair and our vice chair. So I'll be pushing to see if someone can If you're going to be out, if you can attend for early in the hearing, just in order to get the elections done, so that in the next few hearings that we can make this happen. Okay, so other than that, I think at least for our staff communications, that does it for this evening. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
All right. Board members, any questions? Okay. All right, with that, we will move on to our cases and discussion items for tonight. As was mentioned during public comment period, if you disagree with the decisions rendered by this board tonight, you have the option to appeal within 15 days of the findings of fact and conclusions of law being approved by this board. Tonight, we have no old business. We have one case of new business, and we have, I believe, 2 discussion items. Even though we have a fairly light load tonight, it's our obligation to be fair to the public and to applicants. I encourage all board members, staff, applicants, members of the public to be concise in their comments and in their presentations. I'll be limiting staff to about 3 minutes for a presentation, applicants to 5, and public comment to 2, as usual. Okay, so seeing that there's no old business, we're going to move on to new business. The first case is 2022. First case is not about Camino Ranchitos. This is Angela's case.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. 905 Camino Ranchitos consists of a 2,500 square foot Spanish Pueblo revival style home and a 1,200 square foot guest house. Both structures are Spanish Pueblo revival style, with flat roofs, parapets, and wood vigas and portals. And before we go to the next slide, I made this vicinity map, and the streets didn't come through, but just to orient you, Camino Ranchitos comes up like a lollipop there, and this is accessed from the lollipop. Above that is not a road, by the way, and the Ranchitos comes off of Camino Cerrito, so, and a Beta Street there. So just to orient you a little bit, it's a little confusing back there with Ranchitos, and Caminos, etc. So next slide, please. So this is the guest house on approach. You can see the approach is front south elevation, and east elevation is not publicly visible, but there it is, spliced together. And next slide, please. And the north elevation is there, not publicly visible. That's the site of one of the additions, and then the west elevation is almost on the 0 lot line with the western neighbor. And no changes were close to that wall. Next slide, please. This is the proposed and existing site plan. To finish more about the history of the house, both the main house and the guest house have flat roofs, parapets, wood vigas, and corbels. And the main house features a long portal that extends across the front elevation, and it was built sometime after 1966, and it shows up in the city directory. So the main house is the oblong, almost rifle shaped at the top, that mass. We're just focusing on the guest house, which is on the south. In the past, alterations to the main house included a 2nd-story addition and window replacement sometime before 1980. Per the 1991 City Records Historic Survey, the guest house was a chicken coop that was converted at an unknown date. The applicant states that the guest house was doubled in size in the 1990s. And you can go to the next slide. And the main house is contributing, the guest house is not contributing. We are talking only about the guest house today. So proposed for changes is an addition on the proposed site plan, where you see the circle in the middle, it's a very small addition to bump out a wall and put windows in there. It'll be the same height as existing, in the same style. The other change is to add, so that's about a 25 square foot addition. And the windows, new windows will be the dark bronze aluminum clad with true divided lights. Your style will match existing. To the northeast corner back there, that's a 116 square foot addition. Also height will match existing, and the windows will also be dark browns. Aluminum clad with divided lights, roof will match existing. Both will match the style, the standard public revival style of the existing guest house. And then the third item is to add a new freestanding carport, which is the square dotted box at the bottom. Next slide, please. These are the elevations. You can see that the addition to the south elevation is where that circle, the oval is, and it shows a new window there. And those, that's good on that one. And then the next east elevation. Thank you. You can go to the next one, please. Thanks. There's your east elevation. That shows the rear addition.
Angela, did you want to go back?
Back to
We're looking at the north and west elevation right now, not the east.
right. I'm ready to go forward from the east. Just I think I covered that. And if you have questions, you can ask me as I conclude. And the next elevation shows north the also small addition, 116 square feet. Both additions will match the style of the guest house, Spanish Pueblo Revival. And then fourth, or excuse me, you can go to the next slide, please. So the carport, this is the addition of a freestanding carport, which is detached. That's upon approach, the south elevation is the front, and that's the carport. Flat roofed and be constructed of heavy timber and stained dark brown Pueblo Revival corbels and a tan roof. See it on the west elevation, and that side, as well as that's the proposed carport. Stucco will be cementitious buckskin, match existing. Staff recommends approval because it complies with the general design standards, section 14-5.2D, as well as the county east side, section 14-5.2E. And that concludes my.
Thank you, Angela. Board, any clarification questions for the applicant presentation? We have the applicant.
I'll go ahead and swear you in. Do you swear under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please state your name and address for the record.
Christopher Purvis, 518 Old Santa Fe Trail.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
How are you?
Very good. Thanks.
Please tell us about your project.
The only thing I would add to what Angela said is that the remodel that was done in the 90s was done by Steve Robinson, and we actually have those drawings. So that's how we were able to know the extent of the remodel. Other than that, this is actually the son of the man who lives next door, and he's had a kid, so he needs a little bit more room. And so we just added a little bit, and we are actually, we're limited by well, many things. There's not a lot of extra room, so we're making a small addition. We think it won't have any impact, particularly on the house and or the house next door.
Board members, questions? Conversation? Can you tell us a little bit more about the carport? You know, maybe that these are pet peeves of mine. Can you talk about its visibility?
So it's, if you were at the site today, you notice there's a coyote fence that runs. This is almost like you drop down in to get to this car. So one side of the carport is actually sitting on that wall. So even though I've shown it as, unencumbered, one side you can't see, the other side is as close as we can get to the other property. The idea being to make it as minimally visible as possible. The problem for the son and wife is that it's downhill and it faces north, and in the winter, they just lose their cars. So that's why they asked for the additional carport.
And Carly, if we could go back to the site plan a little bit, just for the clarification. Chris, are you saying that the wall that's along the property line is full height?
I was actually referring to the one that's drawn as little stones.
Oh, okay.
That has a heritage fence on top of it.
Uh-huh.
So we're basically able to hang the carport on that, kind of bury it in that side. The other side, we're 5 feet out the property line because we have to be. So no, there's a lot of shrubbery there, but there's not an offense on the neighbor's property. But there's not, we're not, that side you could see if you were.
Okay.
If you got in kind of the middle of the cul-de-sac.
Thank you. So we'll see two freestanding columns mostly.
Right.
And the rest of the materials are it's all wood. construction?
Right, so I'm actually trying to make it look a little more like a remodel, so it's got heavy timber, and that's what you can see.
Cardboard for model.
Yeah.
Thank you. Board, any other questions? Members of the public, either in person or online, wishing to speak on this case.
We have one online.
Yes, I will go ahead and give her permission to speak. Stephanie Donato, you can speak now.
Call me before you swear. Stephanie, do you swear under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Please state your name and address for the record.
Stephanie Benenato, P.O. Box 1601, Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was very hard to hear you, either Mr. Guida and Mr. Purvis. You're kind of echoing, and it's just making it really difficult to hear. My concern is the visibility of the carport and how much it interferes with the view of that house and whether that's a primary facade. And I'm sorry, but I didn't hear all of the presentation, so I'm not clear. But I have this thing about when people want to build carports, but then they also want to interfere with the view of the house. I just think maybe there could be some other place. I understand you want it close to the building, but I think there's a garage, and I understand there's a slope, but people deal with slopes all the time. So again, my question is really, how visible is this carport? And does it really have to be 400 square feet, which seems larger than needed even for 2 cars? Thank you.
Member Aguilar.
My only thought when I was looking at this, it seems a little strange to me that the beam is kind of cutting through the windows, but it may just be the perspective of flattening out this elevation. And the only way around that would be to make the carport taller, which I don't think is a favorable outcome. The only other question I had, and I apologize I wasn't able to make the site visit today, but when I'm looking at the south elevation, is the door on the right-hand side, is that the front door?
Member Aguilar, if we're looking at the elevations that are up right now,
Yeah,
the door that's in the middle of the red box is the front door.
okay, and what is the door on the very right-hand side?
That takes you to a utility closet.
Oh, I only asked, I was wondering, I misunderstood which door was which, but I was wondering why the corbels were switched rather than match the existing on this one.
Just looking for a different look, it's a different time. I would like to add that when you see this carport, there's actually a 8-foot coyote fence at the back of the carport. So you can't see the house when you're on the property. Or when you're in the cul-de-sac, you can't see the house till you open the gate. So it's kind of like these things happen together, but they're separated.
Oh, thanks for clarifying.
Heather?
Yes, thank you. So just to clarify, that one mass that has the smaller window, sort of on the left-hand side of this illustration, that particular mass where the addition is going to be happening does face the Ranchitos cul-de-sac. So you can see that piece, but then there's a coyote fence that intervenes so that you can't see the wooden door there with lots of little squares there. Because there is a gate and fence at that point, but just wanted to clarify what could be seen.
Thank you. And as further clarification on the public comment, the house, main house is contributing structure, the guest house is not.
Correct.
Thank you.
If I may, to Ms. Aguilar's question, Christopher, at the house, the actual front door is under the portal. Front door to the house, no, but it appears that way when you're on site. So it is the front door is behind coyote fence.
Yes, the front door is that one we see the little squares. And if you go back to the plan, it's a little easier to make out.
Okay.
It just reads like the other one's the front door of the property. It is not that front door.
Yeah, given that it's guest house, the access is down underneath this carport, up a set of steps, past the coyote fence, and then this is the door with the little squares on it on south elevation is the first one you come to. And then what's of course deceptive about this elevation is that the right-hand side of the south elevation is actually further back and at an angle going away from it.
Thank you.
With that door. Thank you, thank you. Make that clear.
Any other public comment?
Sorry about the technical
Sure.
issues. For some reason, I can't advance the slides here. Something's gone wrong. But Carly's advancing them on the YouTube video.
Okay.
Not that that helps you, but anyway, just letting you know.
And if you can repeat when you want it advanced, it's just the sound is a little muffled.
Got it. I was asking if there's any other further comment, public comment on this case, before taking it back to the board for the motion. Seeing none, I will bring it back to the board for a motion. Member Benedict.
Thank you, Chair Guida. So just before making the motion, just for final clarification, the guest house is non-contributing, the main house is contributing. Clearly, there's some obstruction of the view of the guest house by building a carport, but from my site visit, I didn't see any obstruction of the main house. Would you agree there's no obstruction of the view?
Member Benedict, yes, I would agree. You can't, this carport is off to the side and behind almost the main house.
You know, to Ms. Benedato's point, I would feel differently about this project if the guest house was contributing and it was completely blocking off the view. But in this case, that's not the situation. I find it to be a very sensitive addition and making the house more livable, which I think is critical on the east side. Carports and these properties without carports, it's just extremely difficult in the winter, especially with this site, to be able to manage your vehicles in the winter time. So you either forced to either go carport or garage or live with the vehicles that are constantly covered with ice.
Park up the hill.
Yes, exactly. So given all of that, I think this is a perfectly reasonable solution. And therefore, I would make a motion if there's no further discussion. Is that acceptable, Chair Guida?
Board members? Okay, yes, please do.
Can we
Thank you.
take public comments? Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In case 2022-005878 HDRB 905 Camino Ranchitos, I would move to adopt the reasoning of staff in finding that this project should be approved with with all appropriate findings entered into the record, supporting a motion to approve the project as submitted.
Larson, seconds.
Motion and a second. We have a roll call vote, please.
Member Aguilar Madrona,
Yes.
member Berkeley,
Yes.
member Beachside.
Yes.
Member Bienvenue,
Yes.
member Larson.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Okay, we are going to move on to the discussion items for tonight. I believe both of these are Carly's. First one is window repair and replacement guidelines. Carly, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So tonight we're just coming back with scouring the minutes and making sure that we had the more information just added that the board requested. We added for the stucco guidelines. This one, we're really just looking to get some final approval, unless there's any other comments that we can integrate. Really the idea behind this is just a review. We wanted to allow oftentimes we have members of the public who really are looking for the basics on how, what they need to do to either change their stucco, to understand why they either shouldn't be changing their stucco or how to preserve it, or why they maybe shouldn't paint it. Those basics, and then just some basic information on stucco and the administrative approval process. So that said, we also, I think the board was very clear about not wanting to be overly restrictive to the stucco colors. So we just added some lines about making sure that if you feel that a particular stucco color belongs in the project, that should go to the board and we should see that. So those lines were added. We added some of these historic textures, different textures, mud plaster, those items. And then really the last item that changed on this document is narrowing it down, as the board suggested, to three columns, suggesting that colors that require HDRB approval and particularly in certain areas. That said, it is, we are looking at this as a guidance document. So when we look at the brand El Rey is not to be required, but it does help us when we're looking at Pantone colors. So that gives us an option for comparison. With that, those are the main changes that were discussed and were requested in this document. So with that, I'm just going to zoom back to our different textures. Unfortunately, we don't have as good a photograph of the Santa Fe Depot as I'd like, of that Pebble Dash texture, because it's been getting worked on right now, but there we have it. Really that's, if the board has other comments that we can integrate, that's wonderful. If we don't, we'd like to go ahead and go for approval on this and start working towards other guidance documents. And with that, I'll turn it over to the board.
So Carla, just as a point of clarification for the public, members of the public who may have missed the informational session, and maybe the board members who weren't present for it. This is the result of, as you said, kind of the desire for the city to provide additional guidance for administrative approvals, clarity on what needs to go to the board instead, and taking away some of the mystery that's embedded in our labyrinthian.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Yes, so this is also the result of to previous administrative matters hearings where we looked at these guidance documents. We do get questions generally from non-architects or just straight from the contractor. I'm ready to paint this historic stucco building, and having the document to say we do not suggest doing that. Having it written down in one nice one-stop shop, here's the document, is very helpful. That, and we often get questions from folks, what are the approved color? What can I do? Like, and this just gives them an array, a color range, rather than, propose us a color as long as it's within kind of, and then being very, very descriptive. And so it kind of shortcuts things for the public, I think, in a way that just allows them something to look at and a range. And then, in the language here, it gives us, if you have other options, if you have other suppliers, these are points of reference, essentially. So that's really what it's there for. We oftentimes, we get so close to the code, as the board does, staff does, and we realize we very much have to help interpret for the public what has to happen in many properties. So the more we can, I believe, the more that we can kind of shortcut that to allow them to see more documents from us. We do often get requests on, what do you have on brochures for, so I can learn more about what's appropriate for the historic district. The code is not easy for most. So this kind of helps us reach more people a little quicker in their request, and helping kind of harness this request.
I agree. Not having to hire an architect and a team of attorneys to decipher our code. You want to change your stucco color is, I think, positive in terms of fairness. Member Berkeley, good question.
I just had a comment. I wanted to thank the staff for doing this. I want to speak as a former homeowner from 2014 who was completely lost about how to go through this process. And so I really appreciate what you've done, and I think it'll be a great service to the public.
Thank you, Chigoya. The only thing that I would recommend in addition to this is that we'll be launching our zoning code update. We are almost to the beginning, and certainly the board will be a major stakeholder in this whole process. And so having, thinking about these types of things that we're doing right now as an interim approach, the upcoming zoning code will be digital. We'll have more pictures and graphics, and we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. So I don't know if you want to have reference points like this in the code, but that's an idea that you can consider, and maybe just start studying the ordinance that you control and implement, and give us some ideas on what you think improvements might be.
Heather, now that the code update is on the table tonight, in your view, I mean, you asked the question of us, I mean, in your view, is there these are presented as guidance documents, right? These are supplements to the code as it exists right now. And the attempt here is to balance prescription with a kind of straightforward guidance, general guidance, right? We're not tonight adopting exactly this color and exactly this texture into and updating the code with it. We're providing an ancillary document to provide this guidance. In the code rewrite, do you imagine that things like this become code, or do you imagine that we have more guidance documents?
Sure, you bring up a very good point. Yes, we're not adopting any type of zoning code change tonight. but it's just sort of an idea to think about how you want to see that happen. And guidance documents are definitely more nimble. You don't have to come to this board and then to the governing body to make a change to a guidance document. But maybe there are some pieces that can be pulled out if it is the pleasure of the board in the future with any type of update to the historic district's ordinance.
Thank you. Carly, any thoughts on this point?
Sorry, I'm muting myself there. Thank you, Chair, Board. I think it's an important piece to really think about. I think the references to the guidance documents and then the language of how it gets framed in the code update will be very important. So, and that for further guidance or for a general design, a general design standards, like that sentence is going to be really critical on basically how it gets framed. So that sentence can either be a more general, and I think that's where the board really wants to should be weighing in, is guidance documents shall be followed, or if not followed, must go to the board. That language, I think, is going to be very critical coming up, because I think the board sees these as general guidelines. That's the understanding I have. Besides, certain things like, let's see, synthetic stucco on contributing buildings. That's a little less, I think that's a little bit more concerning from what I understand in the last several conversations about this. But I think generally just that language is going to be an important piece. And then that can help us understand how in the future, as these do get updated, because guidance documents should be updated, how that would need to be done. So
I think that's incredibly helpful. Particularly when we discussed this as a board last time, we talked about the way in which certain stucco colors traditionally by past boards were not in favor, and certain colors may be more in favor now. And that's beyond the kind of winds of fashion. It's just as public consensus, as the board consensus kind of evolves, the document is, as Heather said, nimble in that regard, and we have a way of providing guidance without necessarily codifying it into law. I don't want to speak too much on this point. The board, yes, member Aguilar-Madrona.
Thank you. I know I'm catching up on some history here, but I'm curious how the colors denim and gray came to be. I'm just trying to look at this from the perspective of someone, as a member of the public, we call out the earth tone, which now this document does specify earth or soil, which I think is really helpful. But then we show the blue and the gray. And just from their perspective, like, why would we show blue, but we're not showing the green? And so I think those two colors to me are a little confusing, even though I know I do see they're both specified that they would require HDRB approval. But that's all that stuck out to me, those two colors in particular, just because I know it's sensitive, the word, earth tone has been and how people interpret that differently.
I'm going to respond to that. Thank you, member Aguilar-Madrona. I'm going to go back to our chart here. We do have dove gray in the chart. And I think the issue here to remember is folks are going to look at this for all districts. And if we're thinking particularly about the transition district or the West Side Guadalupe, really transition district, we might see a little dove gray, or really maybe even more Don Gaspar. We might see some dove gray somewhere. But the denim, I think, is really just a matter of our sheet here. our color chart, in which case I think we can just take a piece of white, like a white box, and maybe mask that one out, since it's just not part of the conversation of this document. That sounds like a reasonable idea, because it's also not in the listed chart above. So thank you, Chair.
Sure, Rita. If I could offer my input on some matters here.
Yes, please.
We're taking a look at these color charts here with respect to stucco, and I know that I read a sentence in this guideline that perhaps these should be incorporated into subsection D. We're talking about section 14-5.2, which sets forth the design standards in the historic district. And under 14-5.2, there are various subsections. One subsection is subsection D, with a headline or a subtitle, General Design Standards for All Historic Districts. Then E, F, G, H, and I are specific design standards for the 5 historic districts. And to me, one of the things that is pretty confusing about the code is that there are some things in subsection D that under the heading General Design Standards for All H districts, there are some very specific things about specially protected structures, such as landmark, contributing and significant houses. Then later on in subsection D, there are some things that apply to all houses in the historic district. And so the question comes up, is this supposed to apply just to these specially protected status houses, the contributing and the landmark and the significant structures? And it's a source of confusion because under subsection C, it reads that all development has to come before the H board, and H district standards have to apply. So what standards are we talking about? We're talking about general design standards. So we're back to the confusion as to whether or not those only apply to specially protected houses or to all houses. So that is something I would hope is cleared up when we do a revision of the code. But I think it's also important as we look at the specific design standards for the specific districts. So moving beyond subsection D and looking at E, F, G, H, and I. The color schemes that are admissible in each of those historic districts differs from one district to another. So I'm just putting forth a question: do these color schemes belong in subsection D, so that we're looking at general design standards for all districts, including these color schemes, or should we divide up these color schemes for subsections? And there we see there's a line there, and I'm looking at the bottom of the paragraph. Sorry, color. Please review SFCC 14-5.2 E through I for specific information on colors in each district. So I'm just wondering whether or not these belong in subsection D, or whether or not we should categorize them according to here are colors that are admissible under subsection E and F, and then under, say, G, H, and I, all the colors that are admissible in E and F are admissible under G, H, and I, in addition to these other colors. So I hope I'm being clear. The idea is, since there are different color schemes admissible in the different districts, I would want to avoid putting this under subsection D and creating confusion as to whether or not these color schemes apply in all the districts.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair Guida. So, yeah, on that point, I think Attorney Rubley was referring to not what's before us tonight, but a potential revision of code. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. I mean, I think this is good guidance, but if we're talking about incorporating it in the code, sure, let's steer clear of putting it under subsection D, because there's already a lot of confusion.
So I think that though some of those same points are relevant to this guidance document, specifically with respect to the asterisks, because the three colors that have an asterisk are are called out as being not in harmony in the downtown and east side district. But really, the downtown and east side district and the historic review district and the transition district all pretty much have the same color requirements in the code. They all say local earth tones in one form or another. That's the language in all three of those. It's only the other two districts that have different colors that are also allowed in addition to that. Or I think the Duncan Spartan has no color, specific color requirements, and the West Side Guadalupe has the earth tones plus soft pastels, I think is the language in the ordinance. So it seems to me that with respect to this document, the asterisks, if we're going to include those as being not desirable or not in harmony, that we wouldn't want to just call out the east side district, but also the transition district and the review district, because they have the exact same color requirements in the ordinance. Unless there's a reason for, maybe based on historical precedent, the way the board or staff has handled colors within those districts, I would suggest that all three of those be included in the asterisk portion. So that was one comment I had. The other one was, these are really minor, but, and thank you, Carly, for modifying the structure. I think it's so much more comprehensible now than it was previously. And I think it does provide very effective guidance for the public without in any way altering the language of the ordinance. The only thing I would suggest is that the second column, just for clarity's sake, is headed colors allowed under portals. I might change that to additional colors allowed under portals only. The reason being that the colors in the first column are also allowed under portals, whereas the way it's written right now might imply to a member of the public that only these lighter colors are allowed under portals. I would clarify that. The only other thing I noticed was an extremely minor typo in the second to last sentence under the color paragraph. It says required approval in the past tense. That should be required in the present tense. I guess one other very minor comment is that some of that boilerplate language under the color swatches, I think is just, it looks like it was just taken directly from the manufacturer's site, and I'm not sure they have any relevance to being in this guidance. Two paragraphs. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Back to the color columns. In our informational session, there was a suggestion from one of the architects, which I thought was a good one, and I'm not sure if there was a decision to not include this, but the suggestion was to delete that third column that is titled Colors Requiring HDRB Approval, and just add a general note that says other colors require HDR approval, so that we're not specifying the colors that we're reviewing, and it's more flexible for our reviewers. It's not on the list of administratively approved colors.
Thank you, Member Bishite. That one just seems to be a larger change, and I think we had more discussion after that. So if the board's in favor of that, I think that sounds fine. I think where it fell in the conversation, it sounded like we weren't, that wasn't maybe clear from the board. So, but if we want to do that, that sounds like a reasonable change.
Thank you. And then just a question, Carly. I wonder if we need to clarify somehow that there's not a restriction on the use of multiple colors. I'm specifically thinking of contributing buildings where an addition is made, and we have sometimes suggested a differentiation in color to identify the newer part as not part of the original.
Chair Member Bishite, can you state that one more time to make sure I understand?
I don't think that we, I know at least for the downtown east side design standards, the code specifies that all, that the building be a single color. But I think there's been cases where we suggest a differentiation in color for an addition to distinguish it from the old. And I wonder if this document should clarify that the use of multiple colors might be permitted, or it's just a
Thank
question. I think maybe it's not the right place to do it, but I think we do that sometimes.
Thank you, Member Boucher. I think I understand that better now. That's good.
And then I have one other question, if you don't mind. With respect to the cement stucco under material, the sentence reads, cement stucco shall be used on contributing significant and landmark structures. I'm just wondering if we intend, or what, how are we interpreting this for the situation where a contributing structure already has synthetic stucco? Are we requiring the return to cementitious stucco? Or is that the intent?
Generally that's a little bit more nuanced situation that we look at and try to research kind of what's happened here. We've had similar, we have a similar situation where we had a really inappropriate use of paint on stucco, but there was historic paint on this particular stucco. There's a case like that. I think the intent here is more so that we, when we get administrative approval requests, that our staff who are handling administrative approval requests don't just generally approve synthetic on contributing buildings. I think that's something that we would try to, that's a little bit more nuanced. The guidance document's not gonna, it's not gonna be able to capture everything that we do in the division, and I think that's okay. That said, and I think it's a unique situation and that has to be a conversation with the owner to revert back. So in this case that I'm mentioning about the paint that's inappropriate, this building there's a particular building that has had paint on the stucco for many, many years. And that's the way it was in the, I believe in the 30s is when it got that paint. Now, but when the applicant came back to use acrylic paint, we realized, okay, that's going to degrade the stucco further. It has to have some more appropriate paint that's going to be appropriate for the stucco and not degrade what's there. And we can see kind of how it has been degrading. So it was a back and forth of talking to the owner about removing this paint in order to allow that building to, that stucco to remain intact the way it is and to keep the finish that's there, because this is a highly contributing, it's a significant building that I'm mentioning. So those conversations are generally very specific to the building and to what the building is. So I think making a blanket blanket rule on that might be problematic.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree that this, as written, is preferable for the guidance document.
And I think it's fair to say that, we're not looking for anything in this document to amend the code, but just to provide guidance. The audience for this is certainly the public and applicants and city staff. So this is meant to provide guidance and not any conflict. So,
And cementitious stucco is definitely first choice
Yeah.
for contributing buildings. That makes sense. Thank you.
and I think to that point, I think that, the discussion for the board, I would suggest that we take public comment on this and come back and see what the board wants to do, either in terms of amendments and or acceptance of this tonight. But to that point, of this being high level, and not modifying the code in any way, I think, being thoughtful about, whether that third column is those colors with the amendments that have been suggested, or it's just all other colors, or it's somewhere between, like, hey, it's these guys, which most people choose, and we see those often, that sometimes get approved. And any other colors, right? There's probably three ways to phrase that, but let's come back to that. I think there are some public comments, or some folks wishing to speak.
We do have a hand up. I'll let Heather take it.
I'll go ahead and give permission,
Stephanie's been sworn in.
and she can speak now.
Yes,
Hi.
Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie Beninato. I appreciate that these are guidelines as opposed to any changes to the code itself. Because I think, again, that is a different kind of conversation than is happening here. And I also appreciate having visual examples of the stucco, because again, it helps people who are visual to understand what all those words mean. And so I do appreciate that, and that the colors, that the stucco colors that cannot be administratively approved. However, I'm assuming that if there was some kind of either addition or major change to a building, that the stucco color would be considered by the board at the time of the approval, let's say because they needed an exception or for whatever other reason that it would come to the board. And again, I just also, I get a little concerned about administrative approval, just because we've had like fences go up administratively that probably shouldn't be where they are. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Any other public comment, in person or online? Now I'm going to come back to the board and ask if the board desires making a motion for approval with amendments of this document, or if the board's pleasure is to just recommend changes. Let's see this again. Member Larson.
I'm ready to accept this guidance. I think, we've had a thoughtful discussion about the importance of keeping this at a very, as Anthony said, at a high level. And I think the more generalized guidance we can provide, the more we can aid in sort of demystifying the code. And I think also following in the respect of making, preservation more understood and accessible to the public. This is one of the mechanisms that can help us to accomplish that kind of goal. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what other avenues we choose to take. As Ms. Beninato said, I think we can always benefit from more visual tools, especially in Santa Fe, where we have such regionally distinctive materials and expressions of architectural design. So I think my suggestions moving forward would be to continue to work to convey these principles that we have embedded in the code in this more accessible way. It doesn't necessarily have to conform to, strict guidance, but rather work to be extremely generalized, to be more of an educational sort of reference tool, to help for, more efficient processes and applications and considerations of, personal projects on homes. So if anyone else, or if there aren't any other comments, can I make a motion?
I think it's good.
Okay. And just to, Heather, maybe you can clarify, when we make the motion, should it just be citing the 22-1007 stucco guidance, or Is it the stucco guidance, stucco styles, material and color guidance in historic districts?
I'll have to defer to Carly. I think it's just the stucco guidance, but I'm not sure if there's a specific number. The document,
We don't have a case number for this because it's technically not a case, but what we can do is state the version as amended, or however the language you'd like to put it. And I would say the version of the stucco guidelines from October 2022 would do it, because that differentiates it from when we viewed these in February.
Great, thank you. So in that case, I would like to move to approve the October 2022 stucco styles, material and color guidance in the historic districts document, with the condition that the proposed edits that were discussed during tonight's hearing are implemented to the document, accepting the edits and the revisions to the color guide more specifically.
Do you want to be a little bit clearer on exactly the edits you mentioned?
I think the edits proposed by member Bienvenu were read into the record.
Okay.
And edits proposed by member Aguilar-Majano and member Vichai also be implemented to the final version of the document.
Do we have a second?
Each have a second for the sake of discussion. I do think that John and I had different suggestions for the same portion of the guidance, but we'll need to decide on which way we go on that.
So, yeah, so we'll interrupt the motion for discussion. I mentioned a moment ago that I think that, the mention of the additional districts, for the sake of consistency with the code, John's point to mention the additional districts for which these are not considered harmonious, I think is worthwhile doing. I think the point, Jennifer, about whether that last column is just and all others, and Majano, this also speaks to your, issue of why is it agreeing and stuff like that. I think, this is not to kind of suggest a compromise just for the sake of compromise, but I do think that if we didn't go one way or the other, and we just instead left these colors in here and said, and any other colors, I think it would be clear that we'd be making the statement that, these are the ones that we most typically see and may approve, but other ones could be accepted, which is embedded in the text, but probably is not as clear in the table diagram. And that could be a way out of two suggestions.
Yep, I agree with that. Just add other colors at the end of column 3. But I would suggest removing the asterisk, just to provide some leeway, because we have approved cottonwood before. I think, with the goal of being more general, we should probably remove those caveats.
So can we have a second with a clarification or amendment?
Right, so the friendly amendment, I would suggest with respect to the color listings and the third column labeled colors requiring HDRB approval, to remove the asterisks and language from desert rose, cottonwood, and dove gray, to add at the end all other colors, and to incorporate member Bienvenu's suggestion for the heading of the second column to say additional colors allowed under portals.
desirable accepted as friendly. Thank you for the comments.
Good discussion. Thank you, Chair Guida. I guess I was just assuming that the way this was set up originally, with the colors being called out both in the column requiring HDRB approval, and then even amongst those colors, having a secondary comment that some of these colors are almost never going to be acceptable because they've already been determined to be non-harmony. I assumed that that was something that came from staff or the division, because this is how it's been handled in discussions with the applicants, and they felt this would be helpful to have in writing for purposes of just clarifying what is likely and not likely to be permitted. And so that was the reason why it seemed acceptable to me, was just purely as staff efficiency and convenience and helpfulness to your interactions with the public. Does anyone from the staff want to speak to whether or not that's the case? Or Carly probably would be the appropriate.
So, Chair, members of the board, I think maybe the best in looking at these colors all together, soapstone, Navajo white, any of these would also fall into the realm of likely not fitting into the streetscape. So I think that like that asterisk may just be unnecessary and be getting a little too specific. And maybe it just needs to be a statement that like an extra statement of that a lot that refers to the streetscapes, the harmony within the streetscape standards within that sentence that list all those colors, that's to be the focus or should fit in with this general streetscape or harmonize with the streetscape rather. And then that may keep it general enough so that it gives the board staff, the board, that platform to then further work with.
Just
Makes
a further
sense.
clarification on that, would, Carly, thank you for the explanation. Would you say that this category of colors requiring HDRB approval is identical with a category that would say requiring exceptions? Or would this be something where this includes colors that would not require an exception, but that are close enough that you feel that it would be appropriate to defer to the board rather than having an administrative staff approve it? Follow my question? Exclusively ones that require an exception because they're not the appropriate earth tones, or whether this includes both ones that are earth tones but borderline and ones that would require an exception because under no circumstances would they qualify under the ordinance.
Thank you, Chair Member Bienvenu. Really, this is, I think, in putting language around the streetscape, then you capture the rest of the districts without saying these aren't appropriate for other, for these can be appropriate for other districts. That's kind of slips that in there in a way, or you can read it that way. But to state that it requires an exception, I think may require an exception is a good bit of language. Because to state that it does require an exception, someone might be reading it very literally, and then you run across a particular stucco that is historic, and then maybe the addition, they want to do that same color of historic stucco, and then you get caught up in a little bit too specific. I mean,
Yes.
I could see that being a challenge, and this is, and I'm looking at it from the guise of, this is the most common administrative approval request that we get. It is, we get, I want to say at least 15 a month, maybe 15 a month. Yeah. Something like that.
Well, I think it's very helpful. The first column and the second column are extremely helpful to have, because at least we've decided, look, you don't need to bother us with any of these colors. So that's helpful for both the public and you. It's the third column that's a little more problematic.
So we're in the middle of the board motion. I'd like to wrap up the motion if we can. So we have a motion, we have a second with friendly amendments. Do we need to update any of that? Yes.
Well, you can go ahead. It's your motion. Well, I was just going to respond, but I think Carly was suggesting revision to the language in the asterisk, and also revision to the third column heading. If we're keeping the third column to state and may require exceptions.
So I think that the amendment to the motion retained the third column and deleted the asterisk and added all of the colors at the end of that listing. So now I guess I can suggest an amendment that I think captures what we just talked about, which would be to apply the asterisk to the heading, colors requiring HDRB approval, to say something like, to determine harmony with the streetscape and application of potential exceptions.
And they require.
And may require something to that effect. And I'd be happy to leave that language to the staff to work out.
Maker of the motion?
Yes, that is accepted as friendly.
Okay, so thank you all for working through that. Melissa, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, member Aguilar Madrano,
Yes.
member Berkeley,
Yes.
member Beecham,
Yes.
member Bienvenu.
Yes.
Member Larson.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. And members of the board and staff, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that goes into this work. It's important stuff. And remembering that this is about fairness and clarity and demystification. Maybe some of the lengthy conversation as to how overly prescriptive our plans is, but that may just be me. So let's move on to the next item, which is also a discussion item about public guidance documents. In this case, this is probably for Windows. Is that right?
Thank you, Chair. Windows. So staff spends quite a lot of time explaining why we need a status review or primary facade designations in order to do window replacements. Where we spend a lot of time trying to educate the public on why you can't replace your windows without a window assessment, or why it may not be energy efficient to replace them with those windows. So we had an informational presentation in January or February. Mara Saxer from the Historic Santa Fe Foundation gave that. So this document is kind of a result of that, the discussion, the code, and then procedurally what we go through as staff normally to these are regular conversations that we have. And so again, the idea is that we have one spot that helps give some background, some language, some terminology, a little bit of history, a little bit of information about sustainability, excuse me, and longevity, so that applicants really start to understand how replacing that window might just be the short-term solution for them, but may require them to replace their windows again in 10 years, rather than doing a little bit more work up front. So, and then we have a little bit on, the process, what it means to get through. And this is kind of the trickier bit. when it means to repair or replace your window, when an administrative approval is required, and then the actual request. What does it mean when you're requesting? What do we look for? Is your building contributing, non-contributing? Because that's the first question. After that, we see what bucket these buildings fall into, and then does it need a status review? Is it older than 50 years? Does it have historic windows on it? There's a lot of mystification for the public here, and so generally a site visit just about replacement windows tends to go a little longer than maybe a full remodel, which is just because it requires public education. And so being able to send a document out in advance before going even out on a site visit, just so that we are kind of on the same footing, can really help staff and the public start to understand and cozy up to the idea of, this is what I am looking at to replace my windows, and why. Because there's when you're faced with, here's all the things you have to do, and sometimes the why gets some closed ears. And so allowing them to sit with this document helps staff, it helps the board. I think it helps us retain more historic fabric. That said, our code doesn't really protect non-primary facades very clearly on contributing buildings. So we do end up losing that historic fabric. So that's something in the code rewrite we might want to look closely at, because in our national register buildings, or buildings that are contributing and highly contributing, that might be concerning for our national register districts. So I'll just put that out there. So kind of the organization, that's a little tricky here on, giving some guidance on, we don't really want to replace ripple glass when we see it. Rolled glass is very unique to buildings. That's one way when you drive through the historic districts, a historic building from either a remodeled or non-historic building. The windows are a big indicator. They are a huge character feature. So we want to discourage that generally and just make a statement. And then just allow for some clarity around storm windows and screens and snap and muttons, because snap and muttons are, we do a lot of talking with applicants on how that's not advisable on a regular basis. So because that's not really within the intent of the code, or at least we don't see it that way. So that said, we do have one note about colors. So non-arresting colors, consider the streetscape harmony may be chosen. So that's an important note. And then we get into some of the district standards and just being very clear about solar collection on south-facing facades. Okay, that said, that's a general overview. I will say a couple more things about the window assessment. Window assessments are generally required, so the board has enough information to go forward and to approve a replacement or not. Is it really degraded beyond 30% for each piece? It's a hard, is it degraded beyond repair is what the code says. We interpret it that way. Now, that stated, it really requires someone who is not trying to replace the windows to assess that. Like it requires a third-party assessor. So the Historic Preservation Division has an approved list that we've worked with for several years. And that's a common thing that historic preservation districts do. And so we have 3 assessors that generally get added to. That list can be made. I think that list just needs to be on our website and more readily available. And so that when people want to apply to get on it, they can be interviewed to be on the list. But they are window repair, where there are people who actively do window restoration work. So that's an important factor, I think, not just a contractor saying all the windows are degraded, so we're submitting our assessment. So because that's most of the time, that's really hard to understand that as proof. So that covers the window evaluators. Okay, and then there's one other item that we want to make sure we hit on this. Oh, of course, the divided lights. Downtown East Side does require divided lights. So we do regularly see non-divided lights. Well, the downtown in East Side requires divided lights on old Santa Fe style buildings. Recent Santa Fe style buildings is not required on non-publicly visible facades. Now, I want to go over that nuance of that light division and why it is the way it is, the 30-inch maximum. And that's just because the width of a Model T, the bed between the wheel beds, could fit a 30-inch piece of glass. So that's why we see less than 30 inches or less in our downtown East Side as the majority of windows. So that's just the intent behind the code there. And I think it's important for us to kind of remember the intent as we look at writing guidelines. Okay, with that said, I'm going to turn it over to board discussion and questions. Any sort of comments around organization of this document, graphics, general comments about where it needs cleanup, go for it. We'd love to have them.
Thank you, Carly. Member Aguilar.
Thank you. I think we heard a couple of compliments tonight about the stucco guidelines and how people appreciated kind of the visual quality of it. So I'm wondering if some photos might be helpful for members of the public in this document as well, maybe illustrating the different type of windows, snap ones, et cetera. And then trying to potentially field some questions for staff in the future as well. Let's see, I'm on page 2 right now, requesting replacement window section. Let's see, I think, sorry. So where it's talking about is the building contributing or non-contributing, I think it might be helpful here, just a really quick sentence to say where a member of the public can go to find out what the current status of their house is. I know that it's the GIS website, but maybe not everyone does. And then also, I don't think the GIS website states the date of the last review, so maybe some guidance just on how an applicant would find out that bit of information might be helpful and alleviate some questions for you guys in the future. And then the next paragraph on contributing structures, the last sentence, which refers to the window assessor list. I think with anything like this, especially if this is something that might be emailed out to an applicant prior or during communication, it'd be helpful just to have that be a link directly to the city website, and I think that might help alleviate some questions for you guys. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Member Morris.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative of this document and the amount of thought that has gone into this. I think for me, I don't know that a photographic representation would be the most beneficial, because I think it can get a little bit more nuanced with, window types. So instead, I would recommend referencing the, Virginia McAllister's Field Guide to American Houses that has generalized, diagrams of windows, that can be used sort of to define, the types that you reference. And my other comment is under the brief history paragraph, or brief history section in the second paragraph for non-historic windows. I'm not sure that I agree that we would call these non-historic windows, because, you know, we might want to differentiate and say, you know, maybe modernist windows or post-war windows, when, you know, for post-World War II windows, when referencing, you know, the aluminum and, you know, different types from that period, and then maybe adding contemporary windows, as a material, or as a section under brief history. But in that case, you can, move the sentence of the metal or vinyl clad windows were introduced post 1960. And I think with that, it would be a lot more, clear. And, I think sometimes, you know, when we call something non-historic, sometimes we mean, you know, it's non-significant, which is fine, but of course, it's up to discussion. So, when we say non-historic, we're implying that it's not of significance or importance. So I just think, you know, modifying that would be a benefit. And I think that's all that I have.
Other board members? I think, John,
No, it's been.
Oh. yes, Member Beecham.
Thank you. Just two small things. On the second page under HDRB approval of windows, item number 2, I believe requires the same parenthetical that item number 4 includes, requesting a code exception required for window replacement on primary facades for historic windows. And then in the last page, the first paragraph under district standards, just a clarification that the 30 inches is a maximum. So instead of the words less than 30 inches, less than or equal to 30 inches of glazing or 30 inches maximum glazing.
Member Van Buren.
Thank you, Chair Guida. So, actually, quite a few comments, so bear with me for a minute. It's a great document. I think it's extremely helpful, but I'll just go through the comments that I have since you asked for us to do so. Under the brief history, I noticed what Member Larson was pointing out, and I think it's very important, which she's just highlighting. And that word historic is very ambiguous in this usage. So I think one solution would just be to take out the 2 headings, historic windows and non-historic windows, and just state the history. And that would solve the problem, I think, because those vinyl and fiberglass windows are now historic under our ordinance if they weren't started in the 1950s. And of course, the metal as well, vinyl class. So that's just the you know, the rolling historicism of our ordinance. But it is useful, I think, to have that general history there. I'm really glad we have the statements regarding the R values and sustainability issues. I thought those were very important for my own understanding of this issue when our historian made that presentation, and it's been useful to me in addressing replacement as it's come before since then. So I think it's helpful for us and the public to have those statements. On window repair and replacement approval process, I just wanted to be sure that we're consistent with the language that was already adopted prior to my time in the policy governing what matters can be administratively approved and what matters require board approval. And I think you're consistent, but I would add one additional sentence to paragraph 2, where it talks about window replacements on non-primary facades of contributing buildings. The language that is in our other policy documents also includes staff to use discretion when reviewing requests to replace historic materials on non-primary facades, to defer to the HDRB when needed. I would just include that for consistency's sake. And I would also suggest at least that we add to that the language in 5.2 D1A, that the removal of historic materials that embody the structure's status shall be prohibited. I would state something to the effect that after adding the language of the policy guidance, something like keeping in mind the prohibition in 14-5.2 D1A that the removal of historic materials that embody the structure's status shall be prohibited. My suggestion there is just that I think that that's separate from the primary facade designation, and that's where staff may say, even though this is a primary facade, we still want to present this issue to the board. Member Beachside pointed out under HDRB approval of windows, that paragraph 2 also requires a code exception. I was also wondering if number 3 does as well. I'm just not sure. I would assume it does for significant buildings. It doesn't make sense to me that it would not apply to significant buildings as well, since they're all primary facades. So I would just ask staff to confirm that, and I think that both 2, 3, and all 2, 3, and 4 paragraphs should have the same language that 4 now has. That paragraph parenthesis requesting a code exception required, close parenthesis. The next section, requesting replacement windows. I think that all of this applies to significant as well as contributing buildings and maybe landmark buildings as well. So I would suggest that we start that paragraph with, is your building significant, contributing, or non-contributing? I don't know if we need to address landmark. And then the next heading would be significant and contributing structures. I think all of that language applies to both. I have a question about the 30% degraded. I just can't recall where that comes from. Is that something that is just historical practice? I'm sure it's not set forth in the ordinance, but. And I
Which
don't
one?
necessarily agree with it. Just wondering.
Sorry,
Policy guidance, where it comes from.
member Bienvenue, can you state that, which area again?
The 30%, then it must be at least 30% degraded to qualify as being beyond repair. I just can't recall. I've heard that said before. I just can't recall where that's derived from.
So that has been the procedural interpretation of not repairable versus non-repairable windows. So that's one thing we have in one of our internal procedures manuals. That's essentially what we determine as repairable versus not, because there's not a clear there's not a definition within our code of repairable versus not.
And has that been pretty much what we've been applying all along when decisions come before the board?
That is correct.
And is that what the window assessors apply when they decide whether, in their opinion, it's repairable or not?
That is correct.
Okay, then that seems perfectly acceptable then. I don't think that the citation to 14.5.2C3B is accurate, though I'm not sure what that's referring to. That may just be a remnant of some prior provision. I'm just not sure where that comes from. Might need to be stricken.
Beyond repair. Oh, I see. That can be broken out into, that needs to be 2 separate sentences. That it's beyond repair, and then the 30% degraded, the definition of beyond repair versus the 30% degraded can be separated into 2 sentences. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm still not sure that C3B has anything relating to that issue, but again, I'll just defer, just pointing it out. For And this is just a language issue, where it says, the next paragraph says, once the windows are proven to be beyond repair, the windows shall be duplicated. I think it might be more accurate to say, if the windows are proven to be beyond repair and replacement in kind is approved by the HDRB, then the windows shall be duplicated in size style, because that's really the process that would have to be gone through in order for that to take effect. So just for clarity for the public, that they would understand that HDRB has to approve replacement in kind. So I would add that language. The next section on non-primary facades, I would point out the same language again and include it from 14.5.2 D1A. I think I got that right. Yeah, D1A, that removal of historic materials that embody the status shall be prohibited. I read that to mean that that applies to historic windows, could apply to historic windows, even on non-primary facades. Perhaps others disagree with that, but I think that's what the ordinance states. So I would add that language to the section on the non-primary facades. The next section, the very last sentence, non-arresting colors and consider it a streetscape harmony. I think that sentence seems like it got garbled in a revision process, because I'm not sure exactly what it says, and I don't think that the what is the citation? A1C. I don't even. Oh, I see. That's the general harmony for all districts section. That sentence just doesn't seem like I understand what it's saying, so maybe that could just be reworded. I don't have any particular suggestions, just pointing out that it doesn't, it's not clear to me what's intended here.
Okay.
Under district standards, just again for clarity's sake, I would combine the two sentences relating to old Santa Fe style and recent Santa Fe style, and say on old Santa Fe style buildings and publicly visible facades of recent Santa Fe style buildings, and then go on with 30-inch glazing is required, and then just strike the second sentence, because I think that's the way the code reads. I think it would be more clear to the public how that works. I would also potentially strike the language regarding and divided lights are required, because I think if a single pane is no greater than 30 inches, it doesn't have to be a divided light, correct? I think really just capturing the 30-inch glazing, that just the result of that means that if you're beyond that size and a single pane, it's going to need to be divided lights. That I'm not sure that divided lights are necessarily required if you have a small window. But if I'm reading the ordinance wrong, please correct me. The next, and I'll add to that, it may be useful for you to have language regarding divided lights in that section, just for purposes of discussions with the general public. I don't know. So if that's the case, maybe it just needs to be reworded. Again, for clarity, the next sentence in the historic transition district and general harmony is maintained. I would just take the exact language out of that section of the ordinance and say general harmony with buildings of historic design is maintained, which is what's set forth in the ordinance. And I would do the same thing in the historic review district section. That's everything.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm going to suggest that we go to public comment on this. And with respect to the attorneys in the room and the board, who has scrutinized the document and looked at this carefully, I think it's a reminder about our general task here. 30 is the code. You know, this is not that document. I like Heather's suggestion this is nimble. And certainly my impression is that this board can recommend changes to this document at any time. to update it or make it more clear. So, getting it absolutely perfectly right and, balancing the concerns of easily readable and referring to the code, I think there are things that this board should keep in mind. Public comments.
Chair, at this point, I don't see any hands raised. If there are two members of the public that are attending via Zoom, and no hands are raised to speak. Oh, yes.
Yes.
You may speak.
Thank you very much, Stephanie Beninatto. I appreciate having the windows laid out and defined in some way that makes sense to people. And I hope that this will help speed the process along, and because it'll allow people to know what to expect. Thank you.
Chair Leader.
Yes, sir.
I have a number of comments, and I'd like to expound on some comments that members of each item have made with respect to this document. There are two things I want to key in on. One is that as one reads this particular guideline, I'm wondering, is this guideline being circulated to applicants? Are applicants for projects in the historic districts looking at these guidelines as a source of maybe references to the code, a simplification of the code? There are some things that I think are missing. For one thing, the reference in the guideline with respect to the replacement of windows is probably based on subsection D5, and all of my references are to subsection 14-5.2. D5 does read for subsection A, for facades of significant and landmark structures and primary facades of contributing structures. Historic windows shall be repaired or restored whenever possible. Historic windows that cannot be repaired or restored should be duplicated in style, size, and material of the original. Thermal dome pane glass may be used. No opening should be wide or narrow. And then there are other provisions regarding openings, that an existing opening shall not be closed, and you can't create a new opening or one doesn't exist unless there's some historic evidence of that. That has to be read in the context of the exceptions that are found in subsection C5 of section 14-5.2. And I'm concerned that there's nothing in this guideline that indicates that subsection D5 doesn't apply or can be, I don't want to say disregarded, but the board can find an exception to D5. And I want the board to know that there are some specific sections of the code for which exceptions can be sought. And that is spelled out subsection C5 of 14-5.2. Under 5G, design standards and signage, the board may recommend exceptions to subsections 14-5.2 D1 through 8 and 10 through 11. The only thing that's missing there in 1 through 8 and 10 through 11 is signs, which is D9, and that's another topic that we're going to be, that you may be hearing more from the city attorney's office about that in the future. But subsection D5 is one of these specific sections that an applicant can seek exceptions to, and if the applicant can conclusively demonstrate that a departure from subsection D5, as well as the other subsections that are listed here, do not damage the character of the district, are required to present a hardship to the applicant or an injury to the public welfare, and strengthen the unique heterogeneous character of the city. And there's more verbiage there. I think it's important to consider that the board has granted exceptions to replacing historic windows on primary facades. My concern is that if the applicants aren't told that they can seek an exception to subsection D5, you end up with, I would call it discriminatory enforcement, for lack of a better term, or at least inconsistent enforcement. Because you might remember, for example, one that sticks out in my mind is the replacement of historic windows in the primary facade of 619 Asakia Madre. Now, members Aguilar, member Berkeley, this was before you joined the board. Those were historic windows on a primary facade on a very highly visible facade on a street that gets a lot of traffic and is very characteristic of the downtown and east side historic district. The board found legitimate reasons that these exceptions apply, that the applicant conclusively demonstrated these exceptions with respect to those historic windows on a primary facade. So I think that these guidelines don't really tell the whole story to the public if applicants are relying on these guidelines, because it makes it sound like if you can repair those windows, and those windows aren't more than 30% deteriorated, under no circumstances can you replace them. And that simply does not accurately recite the code.
Well, I'm going to respond. I'm going to jump in here.
Okay, let me finish, please. It kind of concerns me that in some application materials that were circulated there was a procedural manual that was that had some application materials, and the procedural manual wasn't necessarily circulated to applicants, but the application materials that were given to applicants had some specific descriptions of the exceptions. But in the application materials that are on the current website, there's no discussion of the exceptions. So I don't know if what my concern is that we can't just change the code by adopting some new guidelines or adopting some new procedural materials.
I don't think that's the intent here.
Well,
maybe Carl can speak
but
further.
it does,
Yeah.
you know, that if we're not advising applicants to take and seek exceptions, you end up with a kind of discriminatory.
Frank, this is a very important point that I'd like to make, and Carly, I apologize for jumping in here.
Go ahead.
We have a very difficult to understand and difficult to access code that creates tremendous inequality in who is able to live and who is able to change their residences, where the buildings that they own in the east side of the historic district. The intent of these documents, to me, is very clear in that they are not supplanting the code. If anybody needs to know that they have a right to seek an exception, that information is in the code. This document, or the stucco document, is meant to be an illustration. If I go to a building official, there is the adopted code for a city, just like this, this historic code, building code. If I buy a book that says, hey, building code's illustrated, this is what the code generally means, I can't bring that book into a city's official and say, hey, it says it here. That's not the intent of these documents. So those are only guidance documents. With regard to, what's in this, I think the endeavor should be to be as high level and as accessible as humanly possible. And we are not going to address every single one. That's what the actual code is for. And so, I would really caution against kind of burdening these kinds of documents with every single detail of the code, with additionally confusing language, and make clear that these are simply guidance documents that refer to recommendations and general guidance and point to the code as the definitive document. Carly.
Thank you, Chair. I think one thing that's important to remember about these is this is not I don't think this is the place to outline our exception process by any means. We're not advertising in exceptions. We will put a note about exceptions in our final draft, when we go for a final draft. And this is, again, this is a draft. We're not asking for approval at this time. But when we note an exception, that can refer to reference further code, but we don't, while the board sees window exceptions, that's what's required in the code. When the board doesn't see when the board doesn't see a windows case that's a part of a remodel, it's because it's compliant and it's administratively approved. And so that's why we only see them in these hearings and in that way. That's generally they might end up on an agenda, and that we've worked with an applicant to work it down into compliance to convince them to restore their windows, or they've just decided, okay, I think I'm all right with that. And so that is part of the work of preservation. We're not hiding the exceptions process, but advertising it to allow people to encourage them to sidestep the code is not something that we also want these documents to do either. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, and then Chair Guida, there were a couple of other comments with respect to the contributing structures section of this guideline. The sentence that reads, a window assessment is required to show that each piece of the window is at least 30% degree of geography for 14-5.2C3B. So 14-5.2C3B reads.
We already covered that.
Okay, well, I mean, I know, remember the end when you asked that question, right? But I don't see any problem with just referencing the exception criteria in these guidelines, the way they were referenced in the materials that were submitted to applicants under the old procedural manual. I don't understand why that's been removed. I don't think we're sidestepping the code by allowing people to consider exceptions. That's part of the code just as much as subsection D5 is. So I think I've spoken on these with respect to you.
With reference to exceptions, though, it's not something that we want to encourage in the spirit of the intent of the code. We like people to think first about what they can do within the code. And certainly we're not trying to hide anything. And if somebody asks a question, well, if I want to pursue this, can I? And we always say, yes, that is our option. But primarily we lead with, trying to identify solutions that matches their program, as well as follows the intent and requirements of the code first.
And if and Carly can speak to this more, and perhaps Member Larson, if I'm correct, the aspect of our code that allows for removal of historic materials and contributing buildings is out of step with conventional preservation practice. Is that not a concern?
I'm sorry, can you?
Yes, so that our code allows for the removal of historic materials on contributing buildings and significant buildings. That we have an exception for that is out of step with conventional preservation practice. Is that correct?
We do. I mean, that is why we have an exceptions process. We have a request to not follow portions of the code. Am I answering your question?
Yes, and that's why things are phrased as certain things are discouraged, right? Without saying that they're not absolutely allowed.
Yes, and actually in certain portions of the code, they say not allowed. You don't see the exceptions process until you look at the section that describes all of our exceptions process in the code. So technically, I mean, if you're being very literal about the code, then it says that this is not allowed. I think in this document, exceptions can be a note at the bottom sort of situation, and that can be addressed.
So I'm going to suggest to the board that we've had public comment. I'm going to suggest that we, make a decision here about whether we are going to approve with amendments to the document or request that staff kind of propose.
Chair,
yes.
What I would like to do is to use the minutes to update the document and then present, email a draft, work with the attorney on their concerns, but also email it out to the board for some more later for some more finishing comments before we go through an approval request, if that is reasonable to the board.
I think that makes sense. I mean, I don't even know that we necessarily need a motion on that. Okay, so let's do that. And probably I echo the sentiment that this is an important endeavor, and I appreciate seeing this. I know this is really the first time we've seen it as a document that explains the kind of decision chain to applicants as to what to do and what to consider in dealing with window replacement and code. So thank you for doing this.
I thank you all. Thank you, Chair, Board. Having the input of all of your voices is really important to us to really help serve the public better.
Thank you. Okay, so we have it for our discussion items tonight. Are there any matters from the board?
Thank you, Chair Guida. Just a small request to staff for an answer perhaps at the next board meeting. There's no big rush on this, but there is a property at 1489 Canyon Road, which is directly across the street from the stone barn at 1500 Canyon Road. That was recently, it's undergone renovation and it now has a 10 to 12 foot solid steel gate on the roadway. And I'm just wondering, I know that didn't come before us, I'm wondering if it came before staff or administrative approval, and I'm concerned if it did because the board denied a similar gate that's smaller even, just down the road, 1301, or 1301, I think it was, Canyon Road. That was appealed, that decision, to the city council. They upheld the board's decision. So it would be a grave concern to have the same style of gate being constructed just down the road on Upper Canyon Road. So I just like to get some clarification as to what the history is there and what could be done about it if it wasn't approved.
Thank you, Member Benvenue. I think I have to look into that one. We have had a fair amount of unpermitted work. Once it gets flagged, it takes a while to get through the process. So let me look into that and get back to you on the next hearing.
Great, thank you.
Any other matters from the board? Okay, our next meeting is Tuesday, October 25th, 2022. I have a motion to adjourn.
Larson moves to adjourn.
Have a second, please.
It's 5 seconds.
Roll call vote.
Member Aguilar-Navarro.
Yes.
Member Berkeley.
Yes.
Member Beachhead.
Yes.
Member Bienvenue.
Yes.
Member Larson.
Yes.
The motion has been approved.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Good night, everybody.
And I forgot to just make an announcement regarding Midtown, just so that you know, that's.
Never heard of it. What are you talking about?
That's going to the planning commission on the 20th of October. So that Midtown represents the planning process associated with the Santa Fe University of Art and Design property. There are some historic resources on site that we're working on, as well as an archaeological review for the property as well. But I just wanted to give you a quick update that that's going to be happening and is tentatively scheduled for governing body on November 9th. So this is for the master plan as well as the reset.
Oh, and that's going before planning commission on the 20th.
That's correct.
Okay, wonderful.
Would
Thank you
this
for
board be interested in seeing a copy or sending you a link so that you could see
Yes,
the
please.
master plan? Will do.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Okay, good night. Oh my God, thank you guys for the thorough review.
Well, it's hard to remember, because it's like I never, as I'm getting my bearings, I'm like, I don't get to kind of like get a picture of it.
So.
Oh,